Here's the occipital bone and the temporal bone. Here are the basal part and the squamous part of the occipital bone. The foramen magnum, the occipital condyles, the external occipital protuberance, the superior and inferior nuchal lines. On the temporal bone, here's the petrous part and the squamous part. Here are the mastoid process, the zygomatic arch, and the surface for the temporomandibular joint. Here's the external auditory meatus and the styloid process. The stylomastoid foramen, the carotid canal, the jugular foramen, and the hypoglossal canal. On a typical cervical vertebra, here's the body, the neural arch, the vertebral foramen, the spinous process, the transverse processes, the articular surfaces, and the articular pillar. On the atlas vertebra, here's the anterior arch, the posterior arch, and the lateral bodies. On the axis vertebra, here's the odontoid process. Here are the intervertebral joints and the intervertebral discs. Here are the atlanto-occipital and atlanto-axial joints. Here's the nuchal ligament, the anterior longitudinal ligament, the posterior longitudinal ligament, and the tectorial membrane. Here's the cruciform ligament, consisting of the transverse ligament of the atlas, the superior band, and the inferior band. And here are the two alar ligaments. Here's rectus capitis minor and major, and obliquus capitis inferior and superior. Here's longus capitis and longus cervicis. Here are the scalene muscles, anterior, middle, and posterior. Here's semispinalis, splenius, and trapezius. And here's the sternocleidomastoid. Here's the frontal bone, the zygomatic bone, the maxilla, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. Here's the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, and the palatine bone. Here's the orbital cavity, the orbital margin, and the opening for the nasolacrimal duct. Here's the zygomatic arch, the temporal line, the temporal fossa, and the infratemporal fossa. Here's the pterygomaxillary fissure and the inferior orbital fissure. On the sphenoid bone, here's the lesser wing, the greater wing, and the pterygoid plates, medial and lateral. Here's the pterygoid fossa. Here's the hamulus. On the inside, here's the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Here's the sphenoid ridge, the crista galli, and the cribriform plates. Here's the sella turcica, consisting of the anterior and posterior clinoid processes, the pituitary fossa, and the dorsum celli. Here's the optic canal, the superior orbital fissure, and the foramen rotundum. Here's the foramen ovale, the foramen spinosum, and the foramen lacerum. Here's the true opening of the carotid canal. Here's the opening for the auditory tube. Here's the cartilage of the auditory tube. Here's the piriform aperture and the nasal septum. Here are the posterior nares or choanae. Here's the inferior concha, the middle concha, and the superior concha. Here are the superior meatus, middle meatus, and inferior meatus. Here's the cavity for the frontal sinus, the maxillary sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and here are the ethmoid air cells. Here are the cribriform plates, the uncinate process, and the vomer. Here are the frontonasal duct, the openings for the maxillary sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and the ethmoid air cells, posterior and anterior. Here are the openings for the nasolacrimal duct and the sphenopalatine foramen. Here are the nostrils, or anterior nares, the columella, the lateral cartilage, the alar cartilage, the septal cartilage, the nasal vestibule, and the olfactory area. Here are the conchae again, superior, middle, and inferior. Here's the nasopharynx, with the torus tubarius, the pharyngeal recess, and the soft palate. Here's the semilunar hiatus and the infundibulum. Here's the levator palati, the tensor palati, and the cartilage of the auditory tube. Here's the ramus of the mandible. Here's the body, formed by the alveolar process and the base. Here's the angle, the condyle, the neck, the coronoid process, and the mandibular notch. Here are the symphysis, the mental protuberance, the buttress, the mandibular foramen, the lingula, the mylohyoid line, the submandibular fossa, and the mental spine. Here's the temporomandibular joint, the articular disc, the stylomandibular ligament, and the sphenomandibular ligament. Here are the lateral pterygoid muscle, the medial pterygoid muscle, the temporalis, and the masseter. On the hyoid bone, here's the body, the greater horn, and the lesser horn. Here are the mylohyoid muscles, the geniohyoid, the stylohyoid, the digastric, the omohyoid, sternohyoid, and the thyrohyoid. Here's the genioglossus muscle, and here's the hyoglossus. Here are the gingivae, the hard palate, the soft palate, and the uvula. Here are the palatoglossal arch and the palatopharyngeal arch. Here's the tonsil. Here's the pterygomandibular band, the buccinator muscle, and the orbicularis oris muscle. Here are the teeth, the incisors, the canine, the premolars, and the molars. Here's the crown of the tooth, the root, and the apex. Here's the neck, here's the pulp cavity, here's the apical canal, and the periodontal membrane. Here's the parotid gland and the parotid duct. Here's the submandibular gland and its duct. Here's the sublingual gland. Here's the thyroid cartilage. Here's the cricoid cartilage. Here are the superior constrictor, the middle constrictor, and the inferior constrictor. Here's styloglossus and stylopharyngeus. Here's palatoglossus and palatopharyngeus. Here's the thyroid cartilage. Here's the cricoid cartilage. Here's the arytenoid cartilage with its colliculus, vocal process, and muscular process. Here's the trachea. Here's the cricothyroid ligament. Here's the conus elasticus. Here are the vocal ligaments. Here's the epiglottis, the aryepiglottic fold, the vallecula, and the piriform recess. Here's the vestibule, the vestibular fold, and the vocal fold. Here's the cricothyroid muscle, the cricoarytenoids, posterior and lateral, the thyroarytenoid muscle, and the transverse arytenoid muscle. Here are the parathyroid glands and the thyroid gland. Here are the thyrohyoid, sternothyroid, omohyoid, and sternohyoid muscles.